Think about it. In the 1930s, Germany completely transformed. A nation that had been utterly shattered by World War I becomes this terrifying military powerhouse, ready to unleash a new war on the entire world. And this whole seismic shift, it was all driven by one man, Adolf Hitler. So you gotta ask, right? How on earth did this happen? How did this political nobody, manage to capture the hearts and minds of an entire nation? How did his so-called magnetism become Germany's fatal attraction? All right, so to really get a grip on this, we're gonna break it down. We'll look at the perfect storm of events that let Nazism take hold. First, you've got a nation in total crisis. Then, the man who steps into that void. We'll talk about the myth he sold, the followers he gathered around him, and, this is key, how a massive failure was actually spun into a powerful legend. All right, let's start at the beginning. To even begin to understand Hitler, you have to understand the Germany he came from. You see, after World War I, this was a proud, powerful nation that had been brought completely to its knees. And its people, they were just left feeling totally humiliated, with no sense of pride left. So, the years right after the war, wow, it was just one crisis after another, a relentless cascade. Imagine this. Propaganda had been telling the German people for years they were winning the war, so the defeat in 1918, it was a complete and utter shock. Then came the Treaty of Versailles, which, most Germans saw it as an absolute outrage. It demanded these insane reparations and basically crippled their military. And as if that wasn't enough, by 1923, inflation was so out of control that their money was literally worthless. So how do people even begin to process something like that? This sudden, impossible collapse? Well, for a really dangerous minority on the far right, the answer was something called the stab-in-the-back theory. The idea was that the army was never really defeated on the battlefield. No, they were betrayed from within. This gave them a simple, powerful scapegoat for all of Germany's anger and humiliation. And all of this national chaos, it created an opening for a very, very unlikely figure. Because the man who stepped into all this was, let's be honest, a complete nobody. It's pretty wild when you look at the massive gap between the public image Hitler built for himself and who he actually was. He wasn't some brilliant artist. He was rejected from art school. People who knew him then called him a layabout. And a frontline war hero? Not really. He was a runner, a job that the guys in the trenches considered pretty cushy. In fact, he was never promoted because his superiors thought he lacked leadership skills. And a political genius? Come on. He was a terrible student who never really had a coherent education. Yeah, he wasn't some original thinker, not at all. He was more like an expert synthesizer. Someone described his mind as being a bit like a Hoover, just sucking up this whole mishmash of racist and nationalist ideas that were floating around at the time. He just repackaged it all into this incredibly potent and dangerous ideology. So after the war, Hitler is kind of drifting aimless. He stays in the army, and they give him a new job. Go spy on all these small, radical political groups popping up in Munich. And it's there, while he's supposed to be observing this tiny fringe group called the German Workers' Party, that he discovers his one true and frankly terrible talent: public speaking. It didn't take long for him to just take over the party, renaming it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. And his message, it was simple, it was violent, and for a lot of people, it was intoxicating. He'd get up there and tell them, yes, the stab in the back was real. Yes, the Treaty of Versailles was a crime. And he told them who the enemy was. The internal enemies, the Jews and the Marxists, had to be destroyed. And who could save them? He presented himself as the only one who could do it. But look, a leader, no matter how charismatic they are, is absolutely nothing without followers. And slowly but surely, Hitler started attracting this core group of guys, men who were just as angry, just as resentful, and just as lost as he was. So first you get guys like Hermann Göring. Now this guy was a genuine war hero, the successor to the famous Red Baron. He was this dashing, glamorous figure who brought a sense of real military credibility and public adoration to what was at the time still just a fringe political movement. Then you had the true believers, the ideologues, like Heinrich Himmler. He had this kind of scholarly, almost school-teacherly vibe about him, but underneath that, he was a fanatical anti-Semite. He was super frustrated that he'd been too young to fight in the war. So for him, National Socialism was the perfect home for all that patriotism and all that hate. And it wasn't just angry soldiers. The movement also appealed to intellectuals. Take Joseph Goebbels. Here's a guy with a university education, a doctorate. He was a romantic nationalist, and get this, he'd written a novel describing a messianic, Hitler-like figure before he even met the man. He basically saw in Hitler the leader he had literally been dreaming of. Okay, so by 1923, Hitler's feeling pretty confident. He's looking at Italy, where Mussolini had just pulled off his March on Rome, and he gets inspired. He becomes absolutely convinced that now is the time to seize power. So he plans his own coup in Munich, an event that would go down in history as the Beer Hall Putsch. Now, in reality, the coup was a total, absolute disaster. It collapsed in minutes when the police opened fire. But, and this is so important, the Nazis masterfully spun this colossal failure into a huge propaganda win. Hitler used his trial as a national stage to get his message out. His prison sentence gave him the time to write his manifesto, Mein Kampf, and the failed coup? It created martyrs for the cause and a powerful myth, symbolized by the blood flag they carried that day, which became this secret relic for the movement. So, in prison, he's taking stock. His publisher wisely suggested a snappier title than his original idea. But more importantly, it was during his time locked up that Hitler's own self-perception really shifted. He started to see himself not just as a follower or a leader, but as the chosen one, the Messiah who was destined to save Germany. But here's the thing. After he gets out of prison, Hitler's movement just fizzles. It goes nowhere. Why? Well, thanks to American investment, the German economy was actually recovering. Unemployment was down, people were feeling optimistic again, and in this newfound stability, the Nazis became this marginal, basically irrelevant party. They could have easily just been banished to the history books. But then, fate, or maybe just global economics, dealt them an incredible hand. The 1929 Wall Street crash. It triggered the Great Depression, and the whole world economy collapsed. There was a saying at the time, if New York sneezed, London caught a cold, and Germany nearly died of influenza. And that's what happened. The economic collapse plunged the country right back into chaos, with 7 million people unemployed. So suddenly, all those conditions that allowed Nazism to grow in the first place, the humiliation, the instability, the despair, they were all back. But this time, they were even worse. Hitler had his myth, he had his book, he had a loyal following. The only thing he was missing was a crisis. And now, the world had just handed him one on a silver platter. The stage was now perfectly set for the final, catastrophic act in the Nazi rise to power.